Are you super confused as to what kinds of oils and fats you should be cooking with and eating? You're hearing so many conflicting things on social media and on the internet. Well, I'm here to bring clarity to what can be a confusing issue. Welcome to the Wild Wisdom Show. I'm Dr. Patricia Mills, a medical doctor with a different spin on health. I'm a specialist in physical medicine rehabilitation, practicing functional medicine, and I am so looking forward to going deep on this topic with you. We're talking about the best oils and fats to cook with and which should be avoided at all costs. First, let's talk about the importance of fats. Fats are super important in our health, and your brain is 60% fat. Your nerves, which conduct information to and from your brain to all the other areas of your body, are surrounded by fat. And in fact, multiple sclerosis is a disease that happens as a result of that fatty layer being eroded. So it's very important. Sex hormones are made from fat as one of the building blocks. Your body is made up of multiple cells, and the lining of those cells are made of fat. So basically, you need fat to build your body. So how much fat should we be ingesting? You can look at this from many different ways, but I think the very best way to look at this is from robust population studies like the Mediterranean diet. So everyone pretty much agrees that a Mediterranean diet is a good way to go. Is it the best way to go? We don't know. Maybe a modified Mediterranean diet is the way to go, but just looking at the Mediterranean regions where, generally speaking, research has shown that that diet improves everything from depression to heart disease, risks of stroke, cancer, all those things, right? If we look at that data and look at how much energy a person takes in the day on a Mediterranean diet, about 40% of that energy comes from fat. Now, that doesn't mean the total content. If I were to look at the total content of my Mediterranean diet plate, about 80% of the content is vegetables. About 10% is some kind of protein source like meat, poultry, or fish, or dairy. And the other 10% would be cereals like rice or pasta or bread. And then you would drizzle olive oil on the Mediterranean diet. And so the content of the olive oil isn't as much as the content of the vegetables, but because olive oil has a lot of energy, if I add up the energy from the fat from the meat and the olive oil, that total energy of the plate is 40% from fat. But the total content mostly is still vegetables. The Mediterranean diet is a very plant-rich diet. So more from content from plants than from animal sources, but the energy content, the calorie content, 40% comes from fat. So the main point here is that people on the Mediterranean diet do eat fat, and they look at a quantity. It's about 80 to 110 grams of fat per day. And when they looked at how much olive oil, it's about 4 tablespoons of olive oil a day, which is probably a lot more than most people are getting in their diet, because especially the older generation, because unfortunately they became so afraid of fat. Basically, you shouldn't have too much and you shouldn't have too little. You want to stay in that Goldilocks zone. And then the question becomes, what kind of fat do you want to have? So in the Mediterranean diet, the primary sources of fat are olive oil, dairy, poultry, meat, fish, nuts, and seeds as well. However, there's many other oils on the market, like coconut oil, avocado oil, grapeseed oil, hemp seed oil, flaxseed, walnut, ghee, high oleic, sunflower. So then it becomes a question, well, what should we use? What is best? There's been a lot of controversy on the smoke point. For example, olive oil having a lower smoke point than vegetable seed oils like canola oil. And we're going to get into that because there's been a lot of misinformation that I think has been leading us down the wrong road when it comes to the oil selection. There's different ways to categorize fats and discuss what are the pros and cons of each fat. We're going to go through all of these because sometimes when you look at one category, a fat appears to be good, and then you look at the next category and that fat ends up being not so great. And as we go through the categories, we're going to be building on our knowledge and figuring out which are the good and the bad fats that we want to eat and that we want to cook with. So the first category is fats solid versus liquid at room temperature. Solid fats at room temperature are things like lard from animal fat, butter, coconut oil, and those are predominantly solid at room temperature because they have higher amounts of saturated fatty acids. Saturated fats means that if you look at the chemical composition of between each carbon chain, there's only one bond, like one hand is holding the other hand. You don't have any extra hands there that could detach and hold on to anything else. It's saturated. All of the bonds have been fully used and they're just holding on to each other. And the longer the chain of carbons, the more stable and more solid that is at room temperature. And then there's the margarines of the world, which have higher amounts of not natural trans fatty acids. So trans fatty acids that are synthetic, that have been created to make margarine, basically undergoes this chemical reaction that is caused by the scientist that's making the margarine, and it creates this synthetic, chemically created trans fatty acid. But when they fed it to animals and humans and they did research on this, consumption of that margarine high in trans fatty acids caused inflammation in the body. And it did cause unwanted effects on cholesterol, and bad cholesterol would go up and the good cholesterol levels would go down. So if you're eating margarine still, that was an unfortunate recommendation in the history of modern man. It's not something that we should be eating for our health. We're going to get into what are actually the healthier fats to eat. We're going to get into how much of these saturated fats like lard, butter, and coconut oil should you be eating. And now liquid oils, they are either the shorter chain saturated fatty acids. For example, medium chain triglycerides or MCT oil comes from coconuts. Coconut itself has a lot of saturated fat in it because coconut oil is solid at room temperature. But if you take out the shorter chain saturated fatty acids, shorter, they're more liquid. So medium chain triglycerides or MCT oil is liquid at room temperature for that reason, because they fractionated the oil out from the coconut, separating the long chains from the shorter chains, the medium and short chains. And they took the medium chains and made it into MCT oil. Ghee is the same thing. It's the more liquid at room temperature types of oils from butter, still predominantly saturated fat, but more of the shorter chain. Also the same thing with palm oil. Then you have your polyunsaturated fatty acids, also liquid at room temperature. And what is a polyunsaturated fatty acid? Well, remember how the saturated ones where there's only one hand holding a hand in between the two carbon chains? Unsaturated means that there's two hands holding each other. So they're not fully saturated, they're unsaturated. So another molecule were to come along, like an oxygen molecule, for example, or a hydrogen molecule, they could release one of their bonds and attach, and then they become more saturated. So poly means that at various points in times along that carbon chain, there's the two bonds. And what that basically means, having those two bonds, makes them more flexible. That's why they're liquid at room temperature, whereas saturated fatty acids, they're solid at room temperature. So coconut oil, butter, and lard, solid at room temperature, they're saturated. Things like fish oil, algae oil, sunflower, corn, soybean, grapeseed, flaxseed, hemp seed, walnut, they have multiple unsaturated bonds, so they're more flexible at room temperature. They're liquid at room temperature. And then there's the monounsaturated fatty acids, where there's along that carbon chain, there's just one point where there's the two bonds. So there's one point of unsaturation, and that's your olive oil, your avocado oil, and your canola oil. Oleic acid is the predominant monounsaturated fatty acid. Olive oil, for example, has about 83%. Oleic acid, avocado oil has slightly less, and canola oil has slightly less, but they're the ones that are higher in that kind of oil. And as we know, oleic acid from olive oil is very healthy. There's many other factors in olive oil that make it healthy, like flavonoids and phenolic acids and all the antioxidants. But in terms of the fat profile, it's the monounsaturated fatty acid, oleic acid in olive oil that really conveys its benefits. So one of the advantages also of avocado oil and canola oil. So when we're looking at this category, those are all the liquid oils. So we're just looking at solid versus fats. Sesame oil is interesting because it has the same amount of poly and mono unsaturated fatty acids, and palm oil basically has the same amount of saturated fatty acid compared to the mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids. And the question then becomes, well, how much of the liquid oil versus the solid oil should I be taking in my diet? Some people, they're really pro saturated fats, like on the other end of the spectrum, where one end they went too far in the direction of saying that fat is bad for you and that fat like butter and lard is bad for you. We went too far down that road because those fats are good for you in small amounts. They are used by your body to build things like your hormones, right? However, too much saturated fatty acids could also be a problem, like too much butter, too much lard. And looking at the Mediterranean diet, what they found was that the ratio of the liquid oil to the solid oil was about 2-1. So they were eating double the liquid oil, like olive oil, compared to the saturated fatty acid solid oil, like butter, like lard. So while both are healthy, the ratio of more liquid oil to solid oil is, according to the Mediterranean diet, and when they broke down that liquid oil, it's slightly more monounsaturated fatty acids. So for example, olive oil, than it is the polyunsaturated fatty acids, for example, fish. In the Mediterranean diet, they do not eat vegetable seed oils like canola oil, sunflower oil, corn oil, soybean oil. Why? Because those things have only recently been invented, because it requires a lot of processing to get the oils out of those seeds. So all of the benefits of the Mediterranean diet are not as a result of consuming vegetable seed oils at all. And we're going to get into that in a little bit more detail. So we've already established that it's better to have about double the amount of liquid oil than solid oil. And the liquid oil that you probably should be having in terms of Mediterranean diet would be more of like olive oils and the fish oils. Now we're going to look into the omega-6 to omega-3 ratios. You might have heard of that. That's from the polyunsaturated fatty acids like the fish oils, and interestingly, the vegetable seed oils. And the reason we want to talk about vegetable seed oils is because vegetable seed oils are the oils that are currently being used to cook in almost every single restaurant. So when you go out to eat, you're eating a lot of vegetable seed oil, and it's what's predominantly used in processed foods. Even the ones that say that they're healthy and organic and natural, they contain vegetable seed oil. So we need to find out, are vegetable seed oils safe and healthy to eat? Because it is rampant. So chances are you're eating a lot of it and you don't even know it. So when we talk about omega-6s and omega-3s, what we need to know is that historically, before vegetable seed oils were invented, the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 was about 1-1, or at most 4-1. So omega-6 fatty acids and omega-3 fatty acids are essential fatty acids. We need to get them from our diet. The omega-6 fatty acids are important for the process of creating inflammation. And actually, in your body, you do need to be able to create inflammation. For example, if you have an injury, if you have a cut, if you can't create inflammation, it's hard to heal because the inflammation calls the immune system to that area. But the argument of having too much omega-6 is that you could have too much inflammation. You have many building blocks for inflammation, and that could potentially cause more inflammation in the body. And we're going to get into whether or not that is true. The omega-3s, on the other hand, and people are supplementing with omega-3s like the EPA and the DHA from fish oils or algae oil. Those are the predominant oils present in larger amounts on the cell membrane. So our cells, which make up every piece of our body, they're lined by the cell membrane, and the cell membrane is like a layer of fat. And that layer of fat is predominantly made up of more omega-3s than omega-6s. So the ratio in that fatty membrane is more omega-3 to omega-6. And the concern is that as we eat more omega-6 high content oils, we increase our omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. And what's really fascinating is that they actually can measure that in humans, and in people eating the standard North American diet, their ratio went from a healthy 1-to-1 or 4-to-1 to an intake of 25 omega-6 to 1 omega-3. So the ratio went from 4-to-1 to a 25-to-1. That is massive. And that's as a result of cooking with vegetable seed oils like safflower oil, sunflower oil, soybean oil, corn oil. Why was this switch made from things like olive oil, sesame seed oil, lard? These were the more historically used oils. The switch was made because it's cheaper to make. It's about 25 cents less per plate that's cooked at a restaurant. Now, you could say, well, is that even matter having more omega-6 to omega-3? Is that really a problem? Well, research is showing that when they look at people and they examine their chemistry and they look at the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3s in their cell membranes, the higher omega-6 ratio, the higher risk of breast cancer. I mean, that's pretty big, right? I would personally not want to increase my risk of breast cancer. Right? And the higher omega-6 ratio, omega-6 to omega-3, the higher the risk of obesity. So that is like a real population outcome, because there's a lot of research done in the cells, like is there more inflammation, but does it actually translate to a change in your health? And the answer is yes, it does. So you want to keep your omega-6 to omega-3 ratio intake more towards the 4-to-1 than going up towards the 25-to-1. What's interesting is research shows that if you eat a grass-fed and finished meat, so an animal that was raised outside all the time and not put into a feedlot at the end of its lifespan to fatten up on grains which are not its normal diet, the omega-6 to 3 ratio is 3-to-1, which is a really good healthy ratio. Conventional meat, where they take that animal out of the pasture and in the last around 6 weeks of life put it into a feedlot, very confined, and force them to eat grains which are not part of their normal diet, their omega-6 to omega-3 ratio goes up to 20-to-1. So from a fat perspective, there's some evidence that would suggest a grass-finished meat was better than a non-grass finished meat. Every meat is grass-fed. What you're looking for, are they finished on grass? Are they finished in the pasture and not in the grain feedlot? Now let's look at oils that are high in polyunsaturated fatty acids and have good ratios of omega-6s to 3s. So fish oil has a ratio of 4-to-1. That's great. Algae oil also around 4-to-1. The fish eat the algae, and that's where they get their omega-3s and 6s from. Walnut oil is 4-to-1. Canola oil is 2-to-1. Hemp seed oil is 3-to-1. And flaxseed oil is 0.3-to-1. So when you're looking at that specific category of oils, that's good ratios. Not good ratios of omega-6 to 3 are grapeseed oil. And this is fascinating to me because I don't know why grapeseed oil became popular to cook with, but from omega-6 to omega-3 health perspective, it is not good. It is the highest ratio of omega-6 to omega-3. Safflower is 133-to-1. Corn is 83-to-1. Palm oil is 45-to-1. Sunflower oil is 40-to-1. And soybean oil is 7-to-1. Now, what's interesting is that there's this high oleic sunflower oil. Remember, oleic acid is the monounsaturated fatty acid. So the high oleic sunflower oil means that it has less omega-6, omega-3, more monounsaturated fatty acid like oleic acid. So its contribution to your diet of omega-6 to omega-3 ratio isn't as high. You're not as worried about the fact that the ratio is a 40-to-1, but it has to be cold pressed or expeller pressed, eaten fresh, and eaten within about 1 month of being made in order for it to be truly a healthy option. We're going to get into why I am saying that. And that is because of the next category, which is ultra processed or refined oil versus minimally processed, otherwise known as cold pressed or expeller pressed oils. And this is where it starts getting very interesting. So ultra processed refined oils, these are oils that in order to get the oil out of the source, like the seed, you have to use heat, and the heat can actually damage the oil. That's the concern with heat. Then you use a hexane, which is not a good chemical, to pull the oil out of that product. And then you do chemical processes to alter the color, you decolorize it, and then you bleach it because otherwise it looks weird and smells funny. So why do they even do this? Well, the olive oil is a fruit. Avocado is a fruit, coconut is a fruit. And the way that they take the oil out is they just squeeze it and the oil comes out. The flesh of the fruit is high in oil. The vegetable seeds, like canola oil, is made from rapeseed oil, sunflower seed oil. These ones, they don't have a very high amount of oil in the seed. So in order to get oil from the seed, they have to chemically heat it, put hexane in it, and then the oil is so fragile, it's so unstable that they have to chemically process it to make it a little bit more stable so it doesn't auto rancid right away. And the color looks a bit weird and it smells a bit weird, so they have to decolorize it and bleach it. Why do they even do this? Well, one of the reasons they even thought about making oil from vegetable seeds is because there was so much waste in the industry of leftover seeds that were going rancid in these warehouses. They first started extracting oil from things like rape seeds that now are being used to make canola oil because they were wondering if it would be a good lubricant for machines. They're like, well, we've got all this leftover seeds, it's such a waste. I wonder if we can do something with it. It's got a little bit of oil in it. Let's see if we can extract it. And unlike sesame seed oil, which is naturally very oily, and again, sesame seed oil, you can just press it and the oil comes out. These are not very high in oils and they don't just come out with pressing easily. And they wanted to make it easy and quick and cheap as a result. So they did all these chemical processes and they got this very, very ultra refined oils out of vegetable seeds. Because vegetable seeds are leftovers of manufacturing, it's very cheap. And because they developed this very quick process of extracting the oil, it's very cheap compared to olives where you have to hand pick them and then manually press them, right? So it's more expensive to buy olive oil than it is to buy vegetable seed oil. However, you can actually find ultra processed refined coconut oil and olive oil and avocado oil on the market because using this hexane solvent process is faster and cheaper than cold pressing. So there are some companies where they take these oils and they do the chemical process versus the mechanical, healthier, minimally processed option. So we're going to get into that difference because cold or expeller pressed oils, when you see that cold pressed oils, expeller pressed oils, it's mechanical compression only. They just squeeze the oil out. There's no chemicals involved in that process at all. So a virgin coconut oil is when they take the coconut flesh and press it, squeeze it, and the oil comes out. Regular coconut oil, if it just says coconut oil, they actually take a different part, the kernel of the coconut, so again, the leftover part, and they do the chemical heat, hexane, decolorizing, and bleaching. So you do not want to buy coconut oil. You want to buy virgin coconut oil. And the same thing with olive oil. If all it says is olive oil, just stay away from that. That's the heavily refined olive oil. You want extra virgin olive oil, and ideally it should say cold pressed or expeller pressed. But generally speaking, usually if you see extra virgin olive oil, extra virgin means it was the first time that they pressed the oil, they get the first oil out, then the virgin olive oil is the second time, so not as much oil comes out. Some people say it's not as fresh. And then you get the olive oil, which is then they run the solvent and they're trying to extract all the residual oil out of there, and that's the chemical process. So minimally processed oils are expeller pressed sesame oil, extra virgin olive oil, virgin coconut oil, ghee. Ghee is just butter that's been heated and you remove the milk solids. And then if it says cold pressed or expeller pressed hemp, grapeseed, flaxseed oil, canola oil, those are minimally processed. They are not heavily refined. Whereas ultra processed or refined, it would be the refined olive oil, refined coconut oil, refined sesame seed oils, refined avocado oils, refined canola oil, which is the typical oil that's being used at a restaurant. You just have to really look at the label and read everything to make sure you're not getting that ultra processed oil. And then you might say, well, the canola oil, it had a pretty good omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. Remember, it was a 2-to-1 ratio. So that looked like it was pretty good. However, The question of whether it's refined or cold pressed is important because there was actually a study done. They actually looked at a big picture outcome like cognition. Cognition is brain function. So mild cognition issues would be some brain fog, and worse would be memory issues, worse would be dementia. Right? They took a group of elderly in a long-term care facility. In every single long-term care facility that I've ever been to, in every hospital I've ever been to, and almost all restaurants, with very few exceptions, they are using things like canola oil, corn oil, or soybean oil that are very refined. In this study, the only thing they did is they replaced the refined canola oil with extra virgin olive oil in these elderly's diets, and they measured them over time. And after 3 months, they found an improvement in cognition. Why would that be? Well, when you eat oil, your body's going to take that oil up and it's going to put it where it needs to build things that are made with oil in the body. Remember, the brain is 60% oil. If you are building the brain with the kind of oil that supports its health, it's going to be healthy. If you are building the brain with the kind of oil that does not support its health, what you're going to notice is effect on your cognition, on your ability to think, on your risk for problems with brain fog, memory, dementia. So to me, this research was just like, that's it. I am staying away from highly refined vegetable seed oils and sticking with extra virgin olive oil. And as a result, I rarely eat out. And if I do, I either just say, you know what, this is just that occasional treat, or I call the restaurant in advance and I ask them, do you cook with olive oil, or can you replace your vegetable seed oil with something like animal lard? Animal lard, they don't use chemical processes to take out the fat. You melt it out and then it solidifies and they use it for cooking like duck fat. Whereas these vegetable seed oils are very highly refined and with chemical processes. And comparing a ultra refined source of oil like canola oil to extra virgin olive oil that is not heavily refined, there was a change in cognition in these people. So it tells me that the refinement process is probably damaging to the oil and can negatively affect our health. This is a really important take-home point, and it's one of the reasons why I would love for us to, as a society, recognize that it's worth the incremental increase in cost, like 25 cents a plate, to replace vegetable seed oils in places like hospitals and long-term care facilities at the very least, where these people are trying to get healthier in the hospital, or they're staying there for very long periods of time until the point when they pass away in the long-term care facility, where we are giving them the kinds of oils that support their optimal outcomes and their optimal health. In restaurants, it's a different issue. I think it's harder to do that, but in places like long-term care facilities and hospitals, like nursing homes and hospitals, I feel like this should just be done, right? Because these are vulnerable populations that don't have a choice when they're in that situation. The next category is storage stability. And when we look at stability, what we mean is, when does it start to reach its oxidation point when the oil reacts with oxygen and turns rancid? So more stable oils that if you leave them on the counter, the ones that will be more stable are the solid oils, like the lard and the butter and the coconut oil. Why? Because they're saturated. They don't have that extra bond that can break off and join oxygen and become oxidized, right? So they're more stable. Less stable are the liquid oils because they've got the poly and monounsaturated fatty acid. They either have one or multiple double bonds that could break open and hold on to that oxygen and become oxidized. And oxidized fat is rancid fat. When we say fat has gone rancid, it's oxidized. So what's interesting is if we then look at the liquid oils, because they're in the Mediterranean diet, they're eating 2 times more liquid oil compared to solid oil. Of the liquid oils, which ones would be the most stable? The least stable are actually the vegetable seed oils from this storage perspective. And grapeseed oil was the least of all. We start noticing some oxidation happening within even 5 hours. Within 12 months, all vegetable seed oils, corn, sunflower, safflower, soybean, they all were 30% oxidated within 12 months. The more stable liquid oils are olive oil, sesame seed oil, avocado oil. These will be primarily unoxidized for about 210 days at about 25 degrees Celsius storage temperature. So keep your oils from oxidizing. What you want to do is you want to store them in dark, cool temperatures. A really good olive oil will come in an amber glass so that the oil is less exposed to sunlight, which also can oxidize the oil. On the topic of container storage, which I don't even have here as a category, but because I mentioned it, I should say it. Plastic leaches into oil. So do not buy oil in plastic containers. I've seen people who have bought organic extra virgin olive oil, which is better than regular olive oil, but they buy them in these plastic containers. And the thing is, you don't know how long it's been sitting there for. If they just made the olive oil, just poured it into the plastic container, and then you use it, probably not a lot of plastic has leached into the oil. But if it's been sitting there for any reasonable amount of time, and probably by the time you bought it, it's been sitting there for at least a little while, the plastic is leaching into the oil. So invest in the glass amber bottles. That's another key tip. Now we're going to get into the cooking stability. This category is important because this is where I think a lot of misinformation came out in terms of like, oh, we shouldn't cook with olive oil. We should be cooking with avocado oil instead, or coconut oil instead, or vegetable seed oils instead, like canola oil. And this is where I think a lot of confusion came up, is because people were talking about the smoke point when actually we should have been talking about oxidative stability. So the smoke point is the temperature at which the fats begin to break down and turn into smoke. The oxidative stability is how resistant the fats are to reacting with oxygen and becoming rancid. In the research, oxidative stability was a better determinant of whether or not that oil was healthy for you. So there was this very interesting study that compared olive oil to vegetable seed oils during deep frying. The highest temperature you could submit food to cooking would be deep frying. And what they found was that the olive oil was way more stable than vegetable seed oil, including the corn oils and soybean oils and canola oils. It was way more stable. And actually, you could even deep fry with the same oil 3 times before it became significantly oxidized, whereas with the vegetable seed oil, even 1 time reached that oxidation point. So the unstable cooking oils are the vegetable seed oils, the refined, and even the cold pressed, expeller pressed canola oil, grapeseed oil, sunflower oil, safflower oil, soybean oil. These are not stable with cooking. Grapeseed oil, I'm going to say this again because some people really think grapeseed oil is the best option. It is not stable for cooking when olive oil is more stable than the expeller pressed canola oil. Now, this next category is, should you buy organic oil versus not? And this is very fascinating. So a lot of the toxins are in our environment accumulate in plant oil and animal oil. And when you as a human eat that plant or animal, you take those toxins in those fats and incorporate them into your body. And there's some research to suggest that when the body at the cellular level sees these fats that have toxins in them, that toxic fat is incorporated into the cell. Like, remember, it uses fat to make the cells. That cell could undergo death, cell apoptosis, it's called, cell death. So when I saw this research, I made a very conscious decision that I was only going to buy organic oils, including organic olive oil. So the organic cold pressed extra virgin olive oil is better than the non-organic cold pressed extra virgin olive oil. The thing to know, though, is that in certain countries, Italy, for example, it may not be certified organic, but they have organic principles of farming, so they don't spray with pesticides. Generally speaking, Italians don't use a lot of pesticides. That could change over time, in which case then you might have to reassess it. But I do sometimes buy cold pressed extra virgin olive oil from Italy that doesn't have the label organic. I'll look into the farm that it came from, and if it looks like they're using organic principles, I'll buy that oil. And it's great because sometimes it's cheaper because it doesn't have that label organic, but it doesn't have the pesticides because it's not their practice to spray. So that's another example of some subtleties when you're purchasing your oils. And the next category was nutrient content. So for example, grapeseed oil, and I'm kind of picking on grapeseed oil a little bit because again, a lot of people are thinking that it's healthy. When you look at the amount of phenolic compounds and antioxidant strengths, the ability of these oils to support your health and to combat internal body inflammation, olive oil and sesame oil have higher levels of phenolic compounds and antioxidant strength compared to grapeseed oil. And remember, they have more oxidative stability both storing on the shelf and with cooking than grapeseed oil. So just stick with your olive oil. Sesame seed oil, olive oil is like typical cooking oil in Mediterranean. Sesame seed oil, the cold pressed sesame seed oil, is the traditional cooking oil from Asian countries. Ghee is a traditional cooking oil in India. These are all minimally processed oils, historically organic until the advent of pesticides. And those are the oils that were not associated with the modern chronic disease that we're seeing these days, with the increase in breast cancer, increase in obesity, increase in inflammatory autoimmune conditions, all of these things. Right? So I'm going to summarize this because the devil's in the details here. So what oil would I cook with? I choose organic, extra virgin cold pressed olive oil, cold pressed sesame oil, cold pressed avocado oil. And in lower amounts, the solid at room temperature oils like coconut oil, lard, butter, and ghee, they have more saturated fat. You want to have a little bit more of the monounsaturated fat compared to the saturated fat ratio that's been shown to be healthy in the Mediterranean diet. You're using them to cook, but not using them as much as something like olive oil. The thing about coconut oil is that there's some evidence that people who are predisposed for Alzheimer's, they have this gene called the ApoE4 gene, and people who are at more risk of Alzheimer's have two copies, one from the mom and one from the dad, of ApoE4. If you have one from one of the parents and you have a non-ApoE4, then you're at lower risk, but still higher than someone who has no ApoE4 genes. There's some debate as to whether or not these people do worse with saturated fat, because ApoE4, one of its roles is in the storage and processing of saturated fats. So in those people, until we understand the situation better, you should probably not have a lot of coconut oil, lard, or butter, keeping those amounts lower and more prioritizing the liquid oils that are heat stable, storage stable, good omega-3 to omega-6 ratios, like the extra virgin cold pressed olive oil, sesame oil, and avocado oil. Those are the cooking oils, but what about the oils I can eat fresh without cooking? So that would be an organic expeller pressed hemp seed oil, flaxseed oil, walnut oil, fish and algae oil. So those you want to eat fresh, and you want to eat them very early in the process which they've been manufactured. If you don't know when they could have been sitting on the shelf for years and they would be very rancid. So unless you're extremely sure of the source of your organic cold pressed hemp, flaxseed oil, walnut oil, or fish and algae oil, I would not buy those. The consideration is, how rancid are they? How long have they been on the shelf? How stable they are? And then the best to avoid oils are all refined vegetable seed oils, which means that I don't eat out at restaurants any more than maybe once a week when I'm in my regular routine, sometimes no times a week. If I'm traveling, I'll eat out more, and I really try my best to choose foods that either don't have oils in them, like sushi, for example. By the way, most Asian restaurants are not using sesame seed oil to saute their dumplings or the vegetables. They're using corn oil or soybean oil. I'll ask that restaurant if they can use sesame seed oil instead. Sometimes it's a yes, sometimes it's a no. If I go to a place often, I know which restaurants are like that. Some Italian restaurants, like more high end, they only cook with lard and olive oil. And there's some excellent restaurants out there that are only using those oils for cooking. And so I try to stick with those oils, but generally speaking, that's not what's being used. Same thing for ultra processed foods. So chips and your crackers, pasta sauces, you'd be surprised. Almost all pasta sauces have these refined vegetable seed oils. And seaweed snacks. There's one seaweed snack on the market that I found called Sea Snacks, SNAX, that's made with olive oil. The rest, it's sunflower oil, safflower oil. So just start to read the ingredient lists of the things that you have in your cupboard. Just go to your cupboard by the end of today, if you can, and just start looking at the ingredient list. And when you start to see these vegetable seed oils, even just separating them into a different part of your shelf and trying to minimize the use of those, even throwing them out if you feel comfortable with that. And then there are pasta sauces that use extra virgin olive oil ideally, right? So it's just a matter of finding the ones that have those oils and sticking with it. Now, if it's an occasional food you eat every now and then, it's not such a big deal. It's about getting the daily things right. That's what you want to do. What you also want to do is avoid margarine and other vegetable seed oil spreads. I'm seeing this now on the market in places like Whole Foods, where there's this vegetable oil spread and it's plant-based and they're using it to replace butter. Based on everything that I've taught you here today, based on the omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, the stability, the refinement that goes into making something like that, taking a vegetable seed oil and turning it into liquid and then turning into a solid, stay away from those things. Okay. And they're often more expensive too. So you're paying more money thinking you're doing something good for your health. And in the end, it's actually harming you. And it's like, what? I'm paying more money to get more sick? This sucks, right? So I hope that this brought clarity to what is a very complicated discussion. There's lots of different oils out there that I haven't even touched on, like camellia oil and black cumin seed oil. It just gets a bit too complicated. I just wanted to get you some very high level, what you should cook with, some things you can add fresh to like a salad, for example, without cooking, and what you should definitely avoid. And as the research comes in on other oils, I can update this. But for now, I think this is a really good general span of what is going on out there. And thank you so much for joining me today. If you found this helpful and you're watching this, please save, share, and subscribe. Sharing is caring. I look forward to seeing you at the next episode of the Wild Wisdom Show, which will be next week. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, evening, or night, depending on when you catch this. Bye.